So for anyone who's curious, we now have a YouTube channel where we archive all of our events, so you can check this one out and other By the Book events that we've had in the series so far. But I want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon to celebrate the publication of White Market Drugs, Big Pharma and the Hidden History of Addiction in America by David Herzberg. We're really looking forward to what is sure to be a very timely and interesting discussion. Before we get started, I just want to remind everyone to keep their mics muted to limit the background noise during the talk. And if you don't mind, put your questions in the chat and we'll try to moderate those in the latter part of the program. This event is also being closed captioned if you'd like to make use of that option. I want to give a special thanks to our partners in the By the Book series, Chicago's own Seminary Co-op bookstore, which is one of the best university press bookstores in the country. I'll share a link to their book page in the chat where you can go ahead and buy White Market Drugs if you haven't already. I'm going to quickly introduce our panel and then I'll turn it over to them to lead the discussion. First, of course, is David Herzberg, who's Associate Professor of History at the University of Buffalo. In addition to White Market Drugs, he's the author of Happy Pills in America, From Milltown to Prozac. We're also excited to welcome today Nancy Campbell, who is the department head in the Department of Science and Technology Studies at Rensselaer Polytechnic and the author of OD from MIT Press. We're also joined by Dr. Jeremy Greene, who is an associate professor of the history of medicine at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. He is the author of Therapeutic Revolutions, which was also published by the University of Chicago Press. And finally, we have Samuel K. Roberts, who is associate professor of history in the Columbia University School of the Arts and Sciences and Socio-Medical Sciences in Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health. He is the author of Infectious Fear, which was published by the University of North Carolina Press. Panelists, I'm going to turn it over to you, and folks, feel free to throw your questions in the chat as we go along. Thank you all.
All right, thank you so much, Carrie. I think I was designated moderator for this, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you I look at this as a celebration of a truly remarkable book, and one that those of us working in this field have been looking forward to, something to which we've been looking forward for as long as we've known David to have been working on it. And so I've really been looking for this conversation, and I want to be the first to say this afternoon, congratulations, David, on fantastic work. We all know how hard you've worked on this, the many contributions you make to the field, and this is great. I can't wait to teach this book. That said, my understanding is that the run of show is that, David, we are going to let you introduce the book to those of us in the audience who haven't had the sneak peek. I don't know if is it officially published yet, David or Carrie? Is it out on shelves? It is?
It's out on shelves, so you can find it.
You should definitely get a copy, everybody. Fortunately, the press gave us copies in advance to read. But you should definitely go to your local bookstore immediately. Not now, because we're still going to have a discussion. But as soon as we're done here, please go get a copy. In the meantime, I'm going to let David introduce the book to you with some comments, followed by, in serial order, I think it's me, then Nancy, then Jeremy, or did I get that order reversed? But in any case, something in that way of doing things. And then we will have some discussion amongst the four of us, followed by Q&A, where will be a larger discussion with everybody here in the audience. So again, welcome to everybody for joining us, or welcome to the conversation. David, please tell us, lay out some of the arguments of the book, and also maybe a bit about how you got here, like to the research question and your methods, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. And thanks to everybody for taking some time out of your busy schedules for this. I really appreciate it. Looking forward to this. And I have some comments. They are about 10 minutes. I have a couple of slides that go with them. Let's see. There we go. If I can get them. And okay, wait, do you see the slideshow or just the PowerPoint?
We see the PowerPoint, not the slideshow itself.
Okay. Hang on a second. Let me share a different screen. There we go. Okay, now do you see it?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, so the origins of this book are back in late 2007. I just finished writing Happy Pills. And I kept hearing on the news about what was then called a epidemic of prescription drug abuse. And it was usually described as being this unprecedented new phenomenon, with addiction leaving what was described as its traditional or normal home in racialized cities and cropping up in white suburbs where it hadn't been seen before. And this was a particularly weird time for me to be hearing this, because there was a whole chapter in Happy Pills about a panic over Valium addiction in the 1970s. And this Valium addiction crisis had been discussed in exactly the same terms. Addiction had suddenly appeared in places where it didn't belong. This seemed curious to me, so I did a little further research, and it was almost instantly obvious that Valium wasn't the only precedent for this supposedly unprecedented phenomenon. As a matter of fact, it seemed like there was a continual stream of crises of pharmaceutical addiction stretching back through the 20th century and going all the way back as far as the 1870s. And throughout all this time, these crises were described in the same terms as addiction, these shocking kind of unprecedented intrusions of addiction into places and people where it just wasn't supposed to be. So that raised an obvious question. How had all of this history been forgotten, sort of real time in a continuous way? What purposes were served by this never-ending drama of national shock and surprise? Well, when I followed these questions, I found an alternative history of addiction in America, one that had never taken place primarily in cities or among poor and racialized minorities, but that had been entrenched in the relative privilege of white middle-class neighborhoods and suburbs, and what I call white markets, which are legal medical markets for psychoactive drugs. And moreover, it wasn't like this popped up here and there at little moments. It seemed that almost at any point you could take stock of it. The overwhelming majority of American experiences with drugs and addiction had taken place in what I had initially thought of as this alternate story. It started to look like the main story. Now, at first I had thought that these white markets were in continual crisis, but it soon became clear that there were patterns, that there were three distinct crises. One involving opioids that peaked at the end of the 19th century, a second involving sedatives and stimulants that peaked in the late 60s or early 1970s, and the third that involved all three classes of drugs, although we often refer to it as the opioid crisis of the early 21st century. And as I explored these three crises, I discovered something else as well. Not only did America have this forgotten history of addiction, but it also had a forgotten history of drug policy. Because when authorities weren't unaware of these white market crises, and when they responded to them, tried to do something about them, they didn't call in the cops and impose prohibition and punishment. Instead, they developed policies with really different goals. The goal of making drugs widely and safely available to a favored type of consumer called patients. So in other words, US policy wasn't just about prohibiting addictive drugs, it was also about supplying them. And it was on this side of things that I wanted to look into. And I'm going to sketch now just some of the broadest contours of what I found as quickly as I can without, while still being comprehensible. This first crisis, it began in the late 19th century, which was an era of industrialization when consumers faced all kinds of new risks from new products that were manufactured and circulated in unfamiliar ways. And drugs were just one of these riskier new products, and addiction and harms related to addiction were just one of the many tragedies that were all over the newspapers at the unregulated dawn of American corporate capitalism. Now, at this point, the consumers facing those risks could be white, relatively privileged consumers buying from physicians and pharmacists, or they could be poorer, racially marginalized consumers who didn't have access to those medical markets or the same access, and so who tended to buy in popular or informal markets. But it's really important to recognize that as far as I've been able to tell, both of these groups of people were buying and using drugs for the same reasons: to ease suffering and to pursue pleasure, if those two things really, if it makes sense to distinguish them that definitively. And they also faced the risk of addiction for the same reasons too. They were buying in markets that didn't have consumer protections. Now, the reformers who stepped up to address these market crises in the early 20th century, drugs and other ones, they didn't see this underlying unity that I just described. The progressives, as these reformers were known, they were known for two things, and I'm going to massively oversimplify here, sorry, historians: a commitment to regulating markets and a commitment to protecting racial hierarchies. You could say that they wanted to invent the regulatory state and they wanted to modernize the racist state. And both of these commitments influenced the way that they saw and responded to the drug crises. And it influenced them as they wrote America's first national drug policy, which took as its fundamental architecture a formalization of this divide between medical and non-medical drug markets. The non-medical markets got America's best known, you might say infamous drug policy, which is punitive prohibition. And its goal was to protect society from those dope fiends who were kind of excommunicated from society by those policies. But medical markets got something really different, something that's easy to not notice because the informal markets policies were such a disaster. They got regulation. Federal authorities used new powers to fight off wave after wave of would-be miracle opioids long before OxyContin that the pharmaceutical industry was trying to promote. You can see here on the left an advertisement, and on the right, popular marketing for these kind of drugs. Opioids continue to be really widely available in white markets, but there wasn't a lot of marketing hype and there weren't any blockbuster opioids or these kind of marketing-driven booms. They were safer. But importantly, white market opioids, one of the purposes that they could be used for was to provide to people with addiction as a form of treatment. Now, it was technically illegal, but the whole prohibition regime targeted those supposed urban dope fiends, which meant that a physician in, say, rural Kentucky prescribing for just a few long-term patients, that wouldn't be caught by the system. And you would think, well, that's just a small thing. But when you add it up across the country, it turns out that almost certainly an outright majority, if not the overwhelming majority of people with opioid addiction were people who were receiving morphine clandestinely from physicians and were not the stereotypical street hustling urban junkie. So what had happened in effect is that progressive reformers had really segregated American drug markets, just the way they had segregated a lot of other important markets, such as those for housing and popular leisure and things of this sort. Now, this, for opioids, it made white markets safer. Informal markets, they continued to be a disaster. Their opioid crisis essentially never ended and wouldn't end in the future either. But white markets also ran into trouble soon. New drugs were discovered that took the place of opioids and cocaine in medical practice, and these new drugs didn't face those strict regulations. And pharmaceutical companies launched huge marketing blitzes for new sedatives like the barbiturates. You can see an ad here. These images are all from the book. And benzodiazepine tranquilizers, and also amphetamine stimulants. White market sales boomed higher than ever before, helping to produce a second wave of addiction, bigger than the first, and this time with significant numbers of fatal overdoses, as you can see here in that mid-century bump. Now, it wasn't until the 60s and 70s that this white market crisis was finally reined in a complex set of reforms, the major examples of which we usually think of as part of the punitive drug war. And I'm talking about the Controlled Substances Act and even the Drug Enforcement Administration. And it's totally right to think of them as part of the punitive drug war in informal markets. But in white markets, they function really differently. They didn't prohibit drug sales, but instead made them safer through what can be described as consumer protections that sharply reduced the pharmaceuticals industry's ability to profit and hype up these drugs in unsafe ways. Sedatives and stimulants remained widely available, among the most widely used drugs in white markets, and they were even available, with some exceptions, to people with addiction in those markets. And these consumer protection policies worked in white markets. Sales went down, but that wasn't accompanied by this rise in ER visits and overdose visits. In fact, both of those went down at the same time in the 1970s. Now, and don't get me wrong, these policies had serious flaws, and I hope we'll get to talk about them, but within white markets, they were the closest thing to an actually implemented rational drug policy that I've been able to find in American history. And therefore, despite all their many flaws, they're worth paying attention to and trying to learn from. But their moment was short-lived. Despite some exceptions, such as methadone maintenance, which extended white markets beyond their usual demographic basis, the new white market reforms essentially doubled down on that segregated foundation of American drug policy. all non-medical drug use was still illegal and automatically defined as abuse. And this made it relatively easy to snap these policies back to traditional and destructive patterns. So first, the politics of racial backlash in the 1970s spurred a renewed war against drugs that wreaked havoc on communities already grappling with disinvestment and unregulated informal drug markets. Meanwhile, political conservatives attacked the regulatory state, promising to unleash the private sector to solve intractable problems, such as pain, in the privileged communities that had access to white markets. And thanks to these two trends, as we know, the 21st century began with the most acute case yet of what have been chronic problems in American drug policy: underregulated white markets and punitively punished informal markets. So how do we get ourselves out of this catastrophe? It's a complicated conversation I'm looking forward to, but one big lesson from the history seems clear to me, and I'll state it in deliberately provocative terms. We need to desegregate drugs in America. Segregated drug policy and segregated drug markets have hurt everyone, and not equally, but everyone. White markets have been too loosely regulated, protected by all the various politics of whiteness, leading to wave after wave of crisis for a century. But occasionally, decent policy crops up there. Meanwhile, thanks to punitive prohibition, informal markets have been a disaster, a constant public health catastrophe for more than a century. Why should some consumers get regulated access to relatively safe drugs while others face prohibition markets and punishment? The divide between medicine and drugs was built at a particular historical moment out of the racist logic of segregation. We have challenged many other products of that era, and I think it's long past time we challenge this one too. And I hope we'll be able to talk about that in other aspects of the book. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, David. I will go ahead next and offer some of my comments and appreciation for the work as well. And I apologize, I'm getting my screen set up as well. All right, so what David has done here has rendered a truly fascinating and compelling work. And as I said earlier in my welcoming comments, one that that we've all anticipated for some time. I think every time I see David, I kind of pull him aside and say, "Hey, how's the book coming? When is it going to come out? I really need this for my work." And so thank you so much for delivering that to us, David. Like I said, fascinating, compelling. Fascinating because he lays bare so many of the assumptions about drugs that we make not only as consumers of them, but also as historians. Those of us working in this field often have found ourselves wrestling with concepts like addiction, like dependency, dangerousness, or various cognitive, transliterations thereof. Like my other panelists, along with Carolyn Acker and so many others, David points to a history of these concepts, basing his analysis in the always tempting, or a way not in the always tempting teleology of present day science as the standard, the way of doing history of saying, well, today we know that, we used to believe this. He's very clear to steer away from that. Instead, historicizing even our own knowledge by framing it within regulatory politics, within markets, histories of law enforcement, social history. He's touching a lot of different bases here. The work is also urgently compelling. In particular, what David calls the drug medicine divide provides the analytical framework for much of the book. In short, we meaning society, make and have made rather arbitrary, or at least not quote unquote evidence-based, as we might say today, distinctions between medicines and drugs. And David outlines to us, tells us what underlies that arbitrariness. Much of it, as he points out, as he just did in his introductory comments, but also as he's very clear throughout the book, that the medicine drug divide is largely informed, if not entirely, by a white non-white divide. Here he adds a very significant contribution to this other historical question, or this other sometimes a matter of debate about whether or not a drug's perceived dangerousness stems from its actual chemical properties versus the groups to which that substance rather, maybe is often associated. And I'm stumbling here because I keep using the word drug so reflexively. And David's whole point is that there's medicines and there are drugs. So even having recently read the book, I realized that even the way I just speak colloquially and publicly, I need to really be more careful about that. There is, in fact, a medicine drug divide. They're all substances, but he's very clear that we need to think about how we make these ideological distinctions and how those ideological distinctions end up in policy formation, in law enforcement, in social politics, the whole gamut. What results is a widely sweeping yet focused and disciplined alternative history of drug politics or substance politics, and the idea of addiction, dependency, and danger. I, for one, have a particular appreciation for this work, as I'm sure all of you will from your own research backgrounds. I'm not a quote unquote born drug historian. Like my dissertation was not in drug history. I always feel kind of the sense of, I'm an immigrant in this country. I'm a recent arrival, still learning the ways of how things are done here. In fact, I was thinking about it just yesterday. I think, David, you might have been one of the first people to welcome me to the field when I gave a paper some years ago at the OAH, and you were there and said I should come around to the ADHS, Alcohol and Drugs History Society. Uh, and so, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here. I'm a recent arrival to this, and my previous work in history of science and public health and medicine was more about infectious disease and the construction of a public health state in the United States. I'm particularly interested in issues of racialization and urban politics. And here, I think, is where David has made a contribution to that field as well, not temporally. Most of the work is really post 1945 for the most part, even though there are some introductory chapters or expository chapters that set up the larger arguments. But here, his engagement with the historical process of racialization is a very subtle one. It's a very forceful one. It's to be appreciated by not just those of us who work in drug history, but I think those of us who work in history of health policy. There's a much wider reach here than than one might think, and that's certainly to be appreciated. Um, his racial analysis is not the kind of facile one where you might just look for immediate inequalities and inequities. It's not a kind of very simple and perhaps unnuanced analysis of quote unquote whiteness. Here it's actually the idea of a white market drug is one in which it involves not just uh, political culture, but the regulatory culture, the way in which we frame danger itself. And this analysis goes on so many different levels here to bring together this larger picture. And in fact, I would say that this book would sit well next to any analysis of the war on drugs, for example. I think for what we are reading here in David's analysis is the kind of backhand of the war on drugs. As he's just said in his earlier comments, what those who participate in white market or the white market in drugs get is certain degrees of protection and legitimacy and recognition, whereas what remains for those who cannot participate in that market is a war on drugs. This reminds me in a lot of ways of kind of Loic Waquan's, Janus-faced welfare state, where he points out that you can't really talk about a growing welfare state with also a growing carceral state. And I think we see resonance or echoes of that in David Herzberg's account as well. The characters themselves it's just a wide range of characters. You've got medical reformers, you've got pharmacists and physicians, you've got regulatory bodies, you have industry executives and their associations, you have law enforcement officials in the Bureau of Narcotics and elsewhere, all fighting over, or at least all sometimes fighting, sometimes collaborating with each other to create this regulatory environment, which, as David reminds us, all along is pretty fragile. I think that's one of the many interesting things about this is that there's never a static moment in this. Everything is always subject to change. As much as we may think that government is ossified and takes forever to turn itself around, these things are actually always subject to crumbling with at the drop of a hat, really. There's so much here to be appreciated in and by the way, it's also, David, you're a really economical writer as well. Like it's we're looking at about 8 chapters and an introduction, and it's a widely sweeping, but like I said, focused and disciplined piece of work that would sit easily in any syllabus, not in just in drug history, but history of science, politics of health, certainly in racial formation studies, etc. I know we're going to have a discussion afterwards or after our comments, but I wanted to say that things that I'd like to hear more from the author, perhaps as we in our time remaining, is more about his comments about protection, like who gets protection and how that's, what's the architecture of protection here, ideological and regulatory. I hope you could elaborate that out for our audience. There's also some questions. I think we could talk a bit about what else is happening outside the book at this moment. You clearly have these allusions to these larger moments, and I would like to hear more about your thoughts here and let the audience hear those as well. And I have a few others, but actually I think I will wait for the Q&A for that. So in the meantime, I want to say thank you again and congratulations, David, on fantastic work. And everybody else in the audience, you must read this book. So go ahead and get it. Thank you so much. I think next we will hear, is it Jeremy who's next or is it Nancy? I'm sorry, I had the show notes and then those quickly got buried. Jeremy, is that you next?
Sure. I'm happy to talk. Thanks for that. Thanks for that, Sam. And thanks, David, again. This book is, the three of us are at a great advantage in this conversation because we've read the book, but we're also just at a great advantage because we've read the book. It's a wonderful book. And I want to echo what Sam was saying about, part of its major contribution is that it is a slim, readable volume that covers a tremendous amount of time and a lot of complexity in a way that is very clearly written and can be traced by many people outside of the fields of history, regulation, policy, therapeutic care. And really actually helps to, I think this will help transform a national conversation around a highly sensitive topic that is often hard to draw the nuance out of. And it's a real contribution, and I think it's going to have a major impact for all of these reasons. I read this book as a historian of medicine. I teach here at Johns Hopkins in the Institute of the History of Medicine, and also someone who has done a lot of work in the history of pharmaceuticals, sort of staying on one side for the most part of this medicine drug divide. But also as a clinician, I'm an internist. I see patients in the community health center every week, and I constantly linger on this field of social medicine, which tries to ask repeatedly in different ways and different fields and different places why it is that some people get sick, some people get better, and some people don't. Why it is that some people get treated as fully as possible as persons by our healthcare systems and in our clinical encounters, and others do not. And that these are not sort of random or innocuous categories, but things that are deeply tied to require historical understanding, and a historical understanding that not only understands how the American state works and parastatal organizations work, but how race is continuously brought into this process. And addiction is one of these sites. I think, no clinician, all clinicians encounter addiction. I think the question is to what extent people feel able to engage and talk about this. And I think your book offers a very powerful tool for many people involved in care to help rethink the ways in which they situate blame, deservingness, innocence, and culpability, and deservingness of care in this space. And it's it's a difficult thing to do. It's very powerful. I wanted to say a few words about, I found myself thinking, I've been thinking with this book for a while. I found myself thinking a bit about Ulrich Beck, one of the most prominent sociologists of the late 20th century, who's it's a very famous book of his called Risk Society. And one of the fundamental arguments in Risk Society is this kind of simplification that in the 19th century, you could look at class distinction about the ability to accumulate goods, And somewhere in the 20th century, the shifts to class distinction being about the ability to disaccumulate risks or to avoid bads. And so this question of that these are two sides of the same thing, this aggregation of goods or disaggregation of bads or risks. And I think in your analysis here of how the medicine drug divide fundamentally is based on the ability to frame a world in which medicines are good and drugs are bad, and yet they're also in many ways still the same thing. And that it's that last pit that we sort of take an easy pass on. And I learned this very powerfully having a conversation with David early on about this history of the World Health Organization's engagement in what was first called the Essential Drugs Program, which is a way of trying to say, hey, these are fundamental goods that are, generically available fruits of biomedicine that everyone should be able to benefit from. And part of the World Health Organization should be to set these standards and make sure that these things are available everywhere. There should be a baseline set of access to health. And then they renamed the program sometime in the 80s, the Essential Medicines Program, precisely because the framers realized that they were on the wrong side of the drug medicine split. And yet, if you then look at the entities that are on that list, entities like morphine, like barbiturates, stimulants, that these elements are on both sides of the drug medicine split. And it's fascinating in terms of how we have created a framework that has been so enveloping that we don't see what we're not talking about. And of course, those among you here, historians, anthropologists, social scientists, like this is of course the way that social and cultural forces work at their most powerful. But this book, White Market Drugs, really gives a name and gives a language to that. It's really, really so well done. And of course, as Sam was just pointing out, this is not just an innocuous story in which, yes, we're talking about what Bourdieu has called the left and the right hand of the state, right? The way in which the state, in engaging with and defining these, can either set up a beneficial, therapeutic, regulatory harm reduction framework or set up a punitive prohibition framework. But that left and right hand collides in America, like everything in modern American history, with race. And that relentless ability in this book to trace the role of race in the structure of the state and in the structure of these everyday objects is what gives this book such tremendous power. I could talk for so much longer about this. What I want to end on, so we have time for a conversation, is to think a bit about where the book ends, because there's three cycles. 19th century opioids, mid 20th century sedatives and stimulants, and then the calamity of the 21st century. And oftentimes cyclical histories can be read as cynical histories, right? It keeps on coming around. What's the point of trying to do anything? And yet that is not where this book lands. And I think part of the impact that I think this book will have is in what is a fundamentally hopeful message. And this message is basically saying that in these frameworks of trying to set up effective white market regulation, David's analysis is not simply to arch an eyebrow and ironically cast aspersions, but rather to say there are things that work better. And if those things could be available for all people, wouldn't that be so much better? And in this moment in which we're addressing the crisis of the present, what better moment than now to try to acknowledge these problems and build them into a more equitable system? And these are messages that policymakers and practitioners can hear and can do things with. And it's a remarkable contribution. I really look forward to seeing what how you stir things up once the book is out. So thank you for this.
All right. Next, we will hear from Nancy Campbell.
Yeah, I guess that I was the born drug historian in some ways, but I've been living with this puzzle for a long time. How did it come about that the very scientific heirs who were the guardians of public health, who set out in the early 20th century to prevent another heroin from ever entering the US market, ended that century with a blockbuster opioid that was promoted as non-addictive and really has proved a ruthlessly efficient gateway to heroin. So that feeling when someone shows up with a bunch of missing pieces from a puzzle that you've been doing seemingly for forever. That's how I felt reading White Market Drugs, which really delivers the pleasure of pieces falling into place, a substantial evidence base that was really difficult to piece together, and a drama so gripping that many nights, and this may say more about me than you, David, I chose it above Outlander. So the book rewards close reading as heroes and villains are co-opted by the quest, not to prohibit addictive drugs, but to make them safer, more tamper-proof, more medicalized, and more profitable. Actors good and bad drove that wedge between users on the basis of respectability, whether it be gender, race, ethnicity, social class. It's all about respectability. The book recounts a very complex interlinked set of gendered and racialized projects that mark out zones protected by privilege. Whites receive exclusive access to medical markets, consigning all others, including those not quite white, to the DMZs of the other market, understood as illicit, informal, non-white. So David is really good at cutting through complexity and caricature, writing with care and respect about addiction rather than relying on anachronistic or euphemistic constructs. He takes no easy ways out with the addiction entanglement. Addiction, he shows, has arisen far more frequently in formal legal white drug markets than anyone has thus far been willing to admit. And I want to share my screen here because I want to show you good old Harris Isbell. Scientists like Harris Isbell, the research director, come on, there we go. The research director at the Addiction Research Center at the Narcotic Farm was very puzzled over barbiturate addiction and withdrawal, their deadliness, the fact that people could die of seizures, etc. And I've been very preoccupied by what they thought they were doing, what they thought they were up to. So another piece of the puzzle was the morphine maintenance clinics of the 1920s, where David tried his hand at statistical methods far beyond my ken for rendering both public and private practices of post-Harrison morphine maintenance visible. The clinic story always seemed like magical thinking to me. The idea that massive numbers of regular morphine users just rapidly transition to abstinence or to barbiturates, deterred from opioids by criminal sanctions. For one thing, I never thought that criminal sanctions worked that well, or that deterrence really works that well. So I readily embraced the notion that the American junkie was always the exception rather than the rule, the hyper-visible caricature that belied the hypo-visible archipelago of regular users of white market drugs. So many people were conscripted into the Federal Bureau of Narcotics' moralistic war on maintenance without even knowing it. And some are still. You can't read this book without having a grudging admiration for the FBN's regulatory creativity, which was stimulated at a point that I think David made very well in response to the increasing sophistication of pharmaceutical advertising and marketing. You knew I would get around to the Sacklers. But the FBN knew that it was playing for hearts and minds and taking to the radio waves and the pages of tabloids and the women's press. By contrast, the committee was a bunch of nerds who exercised the power of narrowband expertise. And while they were influential in the World Health Organization and the UN, they were certainly not the stuff of tabloids. David writes that markets are always regulated, and the question is who regulates them and toward what end? In this case, it is clear that the markets were regulated, sometimes in contention with each other, sometimes sharply so, but also allied against maintenance in particular. But methadone, of course, wasn't used for maintenance before the mid-1960s. It was used for detox. And at the Lexington Narcotic Farm, it was manufactured in 50-gallon drums in the basement from 1948 on, and it was tightly controlled. Why? Because it was an agonist. You could overdose on it, addicts liked it, and they asked where they could get it when they were on the outside. So when it first starts leaking, the drug control apparatus keeps it very unprofitable. Methadone's an old drug, but so is oxycodone. Two really different trajectories there. So what David what it accomplishes in arguing that America's fiercest moral crusaders at the FBN came closer than anyone else in the 20th century to realizing therapeutic reformers' vision of a rational medical market is a kind of turning on its head some of the orthodoxies of drug policy history. Since I'm in the business of prescribing books, not drugs, I would offer to you that this book is an energizer, not a tranquilizer. It will not put you to sleep, for you can't really read it without being preoccupied by the present carnage being played out on the commercial terrain. The emergence of critical resistance to both medicalizers and criminalizers came in the form of harm reduction. If white market practices were expanded to include all consumers, to my mind, that would mean remodeling the infrastructure that keeps white drug markets white, and quite possibly what keeps white markets markets. In the sorry end to the ongoing story, it is profits that would seem the gateway drug. Bravo, then, to David Herzberg for this intervention into profit-driven drug crises.
All right, thank you so much, Nancy.
Thank you all three so much. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I think this is the portion of our show where this is where Jeremy, Nancy, and I get to do, I think it's the instant round where we just fire questions at you, right, for discussion. You're not in the hot seat. I'm kidding, of course. But I think there's some points that were brought up in all three of the comments that I think are really worthy for unpacking. And then I'm also keeping an eye on the chat. There's some really good questions that are showing up there as well. So we might even incorporate some of those into our discussion before we open up for Q&A. I think I would like to take the prerogative of the moderator such that it is, and maybe open up with a first question, which is the regulatory state that you describe, David, at times is, forceful in terms of, like you point to the 1970s moment as when there was this period where there was a deep concern for those who participate in white markets, control over prescribing behavior, at least, that was the attempt. And then other times where it's not so much. I wanted, and when you're reading a book like yours, the reader, starts to put a timeline in their head, or even literally in their notes, just trying to keep track of each, the Controlled Substances Act, the Harrison Act. You even mentioned the Rockefeller drug laws and so many other legislative and industry events there. There's also these other events in the history of some of the politics that you describe, particularly politics of citizenship and inclusion. And so I wondered, whereas I think, Nancy, your final comment was that this was about profit, but it also occurs to me that if it were truly about profit, why would you bifurcate the market, right? I mean, if you could get, what's better than having a lot of white people buy barbiturates? Having a lot of white people and non-white people buying barbiturates would be the answer to that, right? So there's something else going on there as well. And I wanted to know if there's any way in which something in this history tracks with this other history of this longer history of discussions about citizenship and inclusion. I'm talking principally about, not principally, perhaps most obviously about the civil rights movement, but there were so many rights movements going on from 1930 into the 70s and 80s that it could really touch on. And I think in a lot of ways, this story touches on all of them, right? So I just had that question. Then I also had a question about voices of people who are not white and speak as such, meaning that they are taking, when they make their public pronouncements, they are making a comment about this bifurcated system that you outline. I think, as Nancy also said, reading this book is like getting those pieces that you realized were missing. And before we started, I much less eloquently said, that many of us were working around the edges of this topic and kind of had suspicions of what was going on, but you did you did the brilliant analysis, to say nothing of the shoe leather archival work to figure all this out. So yeah, I guess I wanted to ask a bit about who else is speaking in this and what are their thoughts, because I suspect that there were many other people who said, yeah, have you ever noticed that, like, there's a kind of different system of regulation here? I mean, we've all known for a while that barbiturates are basically, or I mean, you note this in your first book, that it was marketed towards the suburbs in large part, and to middle-class white women. So I guess, yeah, is there any other comment from historical actors on this? That question was probably longer than your answer will be, so I apologize for that as well.
Yeah, we should be so lucky. Can I figure out how to respond to these really great questions in a succinct way? So there's the two, and one of them, I mean, and they're connected to similar stories, which connected to one of the questions you raised in your when you were talking about what's going on outside the book, and there's so much. So part of it is, I used to, in early drafts of the book, before someone pointed out that this wasn't user-friendly language, I talked about the rhythms of state building in America. Like, there are moments when the state is being built up, its capacity to the federal state, sorry, to do things is being built up. And there are two types of states that get built up. There's the regulatory state, and then what Elisa McGurr calls the moral state, or which I shorthand refer to as the racist state. And that their rhythms go sometimes in sync, like in the progressive era, and sometimes they're out of sync, like the 1950s is a big buildup, of the racist state, while the regulatory state is being left fallow. And so I think that to start to answer the question of how a story of profit and market regulation maps out onto a story of inclusion and exclusion, of citizenship, I think that is how I would start to answer that question, because one state is about protecting and providing for citizens, and the other is about defining who is living here but doesn't get to count as a citizen, doesn't get those protections, and doesn't get that care. And so those boundaries move back and forth at the hands of, white race crusaders and civil rights activists, often, through battles in which gender is centrally important, both symbolically and in the social experiences. But so those, it's not like therapeutic reformers aren't the one who are expanding or narrowing the boundaries of who counts, of whose lives matter, of who deserves care and protection. But they pair up with people, and one moment they can, in the progressive era, the people they pair up with are all about protecting the boundaries of whiteness and the privileges of whiteness. And the people that they pair up with in the late 60s and 70s, that's when those civil rights activists and those feminist activists matter so much, because without them, you just absolutely could not, it would not be possible, to have even the hints of challenge to that segregated basis of policy, because unless you challenge what a lot of white people in power think about the races, you can't get them to see that that addiction could be a problem for anyone, unless you, like, if you started to think of addiction as a problem of these kind of people who are already problematic. And what's interesting, I mean, you say that you were waiting for this book, and just by the way, notice all of you people who may have be writing books, how many comments were about how long people were waiting for this book to finish.
No, I want to go on record and say I never said
I'm,
how long we were waiting. I said the anticipation with which we were waiting. I was very clear in my language on that.
Well, it was a long wait in my own mind, but that I just derailed myself. I know what I was going to say is that some of the research that I didn't do, it's not easy to find people of color speaking directly in challenging ways about the drug issue. They're the loudest voices, oftentimes, as you know, tend to be on the other side saying, well, what about the what about the care and protection of good policing in our neighborhoods? Like what, and that ends up, having a really, I don't even know if you can fairly call it a mixed consequences, but I know that your research and what I've seen of it shows a greater complexity of diversity of voices talking about that. And frankly, like I need your work to be able to understand more directly how they participated in this.
And I appreciate you saying that, but that wasn't one of those questions where where I already knew the answer and I was just trying to get you to. No, not at all. It's a genuine question. In those policy circles, yeah, it's not entirely clear who's in the room, so to speak, to put any sort of breaks or just to add a different perspective. So
yeah,
it was a genuine question.
Yeah, it's an incredibly white story. I mean, and that's one of the things, like, I feel that, you have to tell it as a white story. Like, this is a story of largely of white people looking out for other white people, and that's one of the things that they were, how purposefully doing. And it's a story of race, definitely. And it's not an accident that in those rooms, if we'll just say this, nobody in those rooms was speaking as a person of color. I can't guarantee you that every single person in every room I wrote about was white, but nobody, that very few people were challenging it, and speaking from that. But they still played this incredibly crucial role because those were the building blocks out of which the whole thing was built. And if those weren't challenged and rearranged, you wouldn't have even brief moments like the early 70s when you have policies that look at least like they could be different.
Yeah, thank you so much. Jeremy and Nancy, did you want to add something? And then I also want to look to our chat room where we have some great questions coming up here. So I want to incorporate some of those. Did you all want to pitch a question, or should we go straight to Q&A?
I think we can go straight to the Q&A.
Okay.
We can always throw in more questions later.
Yeah, and we all know, David, whenever this pandemic lifts, we all take them out to drinks and then really grill them, right? So, all right, let's, I was looking at a question. I'm sorry, what was that?
It started out so good. You can take me out for drinks and then you can really grill me.
No such thing as a free lunch. There was a question here. I'm trying to find it here. Eric Seaman is asking you, David. I know you pay a lot of attention to gender in all your teaching and writing, particularly your previous book, Happy Pills in America, which is, I also recommend people in the audience read that if they have not yet. Can you briefly summarize the key ways gender intersects with a racial analysis in the book? Thank you, Eric.
That's a great question. So it can be complicated. One of the ways that gender gets deployed is as a kind of a symbolic tool in the construction of a consumer market. I mean, what the heck does that mean? Let me say that the immediate go-to representative of an anonymous consumer is a white woman, and a consumer who is innocent, but maybe also uneducated or foolish and needs the protection of white male experts. And so you see a lot of appeals to these masses of consumers who can't be expected to protect themselves as a justification for enhancing the power of white men who are the expert gatekeepers in drug markets. I mean, if you think about it, like, we're talking about drugs, right? But think about how incredibly hard it is to introduce any regulation of any profit-making corporation in this country. That doesn't start recently. That's been here since the Gilded Age. And so to make it over that hump and to introduce regulations that limit the pursuit of profit and that limit these corporations, you need to build political coalitions that are broader than just people who think that corporate capitalism, can be dangerous. And so one of the ways that they do that is by appealing to the threat to white womanhood, which is a really like a never-ending wellspring of political power in white-dominated America for most of the 20th century. And it gets used in all kinds of different ways. Like it's used to build drug wars, to talk about, these non-white men, like Chinese Americans luring white women into opium dens in the 1870s and 1880s. And it's also used to say, oh, this innocent young sweetheart, during World War II, she was missing her boyfriend, and so she couldn't sleep. She started to take sleeping pills because the drug company said it was okay, and then she's down this path to perdition. And so women get deployed by men and by like the Women's Club, Good Government Organization activists as symbols in this way. And then it's also just the brute reality that women use the medical system more, and therefore they are often the consumers of white market drugs, and they experience both the benefits of these drugs, which are considerable, and the harms, which are also considerable. And so their experiences, when they reach certain proportions, become unignorable. They themselves begin to, for example, as we see in the 60s and 70s, when there's formal political organizing, push to do something about circumstances that are bringing them harm. So there isn't as simple an overarching story the way that there is with race. I'm not trying to say that story is simple, but it's at least you can boil it down to a couple of overarching themes. With gender, it gets deployed in different ways in different situations with certain patterns that recur, like white women as a kind of a well you can go to get some political pixie dust to accomplish things in this realm.
Thank you so much for that. And I'm going to use political pixie dust at some point before the end of the day. I'm going to find a way to do it. So thank you for that. Zachary Siegel, who I don't know if it's still, I know I saw him earlier. I don't know if he's still yeah, there he is. Okay, he's still with us. He wants to know your thoughts on the ongoing opioid litigation against Big Pharma. Does the drug medicine distinction break down and get muddled here? Now, I know I don't know if you've done any expert testimony, but I assume you will be by any attorneys involved who have seen the book come out. I don't know how much you can comment on that in a public forum, but why don't you have at it as much as you can?
Yeah, just as a conflict of interest statement, I can say that I have served as an expert witness in opioid litigation on behalf of the plaintiffs. I probably won't say any more about that. But so does that distinction break down? So in one sense, you have part of the opioid litigation and part of the push in response to the white market crisis of trying to corral political forces needed to take on a really powerful industry. There has been an effort to borrow some drug war tools, to borrow some stigmatization, to borrow some demonization of opioids, even as you also see this, what I now recognize as kind of archetypal effort to pursue policies to protect sympathetic people, specifically those stereotypical white suburban exurban people who are claimed to be harmed in the first stage of the opioid crisis. So there's a certain extent to which you see the possibility of I guess overreaction and just demonizing drugs to the point that people who need them are unable to get them. But I think that the real risk is actually quite the opposite in some ways. I mean, that's a real risk, but a deeper risk that kind of keeps me awake at night is that you have this moment of potential political creativity in trying to imagine how you can regulate markets for opioids so that they're still available to people who need them, but so that you prevent disasters like what happens when you let the markets be free. And so there's a lot of political creativity. And traditionally, what would happen is that political creativity would be built from its most basic ingredients out of this medicine drug divide. So every single statement you make about OxyContin would have all of these race and class politics built into it through use of words that on their face might look completely neutral, just like those brain scans supposedly showing that addiction is a brain disease. And what you would end up with is a set of policies that might actually be pretty good. It's the real world. They're not going to be perfect, but it might actually be pretty good, but they'll be solely targeted to a particular drug in a particular population. And then like next week, when you have it's easier to refer to it as a drug crisis, but if it's not already clear, like in my book, all drug crises are actually market crises that just happen to involve drugs. They involve other products as well with similar problems. But so the next, you're going to get a crisis that's going to be in a community of color, and those tools won't transfer over, that they won't be applied because they were built out of stuff that made it clear who they were supposed to apply to. This is why harm reductionists, and I think really specifically what Sam calls harm reductionists of color, are so important, because they are articulating a way to think about basically drug access and making drugs safer that are explicitly designed to be able to apply to everyone, and are explicitly pushing against and critiquing and deconstructing these other tools. So my biggest fear is that the opioid litigation and the opioid crisis and all these terms we use is going to reinforce the divide, and as a result, an opportunity to more broadly improve our response, our approach to drugs and drug policy is going to be lost. And as a matter of fact, in some cases, it ends up being worse for informal markets. When you have innovation in white markets, it's a little scary. Like after the opioid controls of the early 20th century and after the Controlled Substances Act of the early 1970s, informal markets got worse, a lot worse after both of those, right? And so that's my fear. And I don't know if I understood your question right, and I kind of got off on a soapbox there, but I'll stop myself.
That was great. I think, and Carrie, I don't know what our time was. Just let me know, because I could do this all afternoon. I really like the book. I could have this discussion all for the afternoon, but let me know what your schedule is.
We should probably do one more question, and then we're over an hour at this point. So I think one more, and then we'll wrap it up.
Okay, all right. I think I have the one queued up that I think might be a good one. At least I thought I did. Right. Yeah. There's ways in which in white market drugs that, as much as today's discussion has been about the racialization of these markets and of policy, nothing's really overdetermined here. Like there's like each chapter is like a perfect storm almost. And I really appreciated the way, like the detail and the attention to historical contingency that you give to all of these actors, all of these events, and to the subject in general. So this next question falls a bit in line with that. Tamara Thornton says, I'd love to hear you talk about the origins of the contemporary board-certified specialty of pain medicine, cultural attitudes towards pain, ? Pharma, ? The medical profession, ? Et cetera, ? Your chapters 5 and 6 deal with the pain industry, and that's kind of one of those historical contingencies that all of a sudden, along with all the other dynamics that you had introduced in the previous 4 chapters, you there also say, yeah, and by the way, there are these revolutions in pain medicine and pain advocacy as well, which I found really thoroughly fascinating. So that was my way of setting up Dr. Thornton's question there. So what do you think?
It's a great question, and I summarize a little bit on that. I just want to obviously, if you want to know the real story about this, you got to check out Keith Waylu's book, Pain: A Political History. That's where you find a lot of the details and overarching arc of that saga. But I guess let me start by saying that one of the things that's really important, and it's damn tricky when you're talking about big pharma, because there's a huge literature of big pharma critiques, and they're so important. Everybody ought to read several of them, but they also they have a tendency to elide by. Sorry, I'm getting like some kind of federal government alert on my phone. Distracted me for a second. It
might be about opioids, David. It might be a federal alert about opioids. So
yeah, if I suddenly run and like bullets fly through the window, thanks everybody. No, but suffering is real, and pleasure is a necessary part of life. And people who want those things are, they are everybody I know. And this is not a weakness. This isn't a human weakness. It isn't like some secret shame that we have that gets exploited by pharmaceutical companies. And I want to put this in the context because pain is obviously real. It's a really important kind of suffering. So is insomnia. So are all the things that psychoactive drugs have been used for and sold for throughout the 20th century. When I critique the industry, it is not for meeting those needs and desires. It's for meeting them unsafely and recklessly and only with a goal of making a profit. And towards that end, the story of pain it's not unprecedented. It's the story of the industry finding ways to use its money and influence to redirect concern about organized efforts on behalf of to do something about suffering towards its own ends. And so, the pain advocacy really begins as an organized medical enterprise after World War II, and it moves in a certain direction through the 70s and 80s, most of which is actually quite, they see widespread use of pharmacotherapy for pain as part of the problem. Like pain is a bigger, more complex issue than that. We're just throwing pills at it. We owe people in pain more than that, right? That's the argument. But they also make the point that, there's no, that we're not doing enough to ease people's pain and suffering. And so that all starts well before the opioid industry hops on board. It's addressing real, legitimate concerns and needs. Those are the origins of all the professional pain societies and the pain specialty boards. Those all happen before opioid companies invest. And they invest in the 1990s. Why do they wait so long? It's a fascinating question. I know we're running out of time. I'll just say that part of it has to do with the crack epidemic, the crack panic, and the and deregulatory politics of the 80s. You put those two together and you have addiction getting closely associated with racialized populations in cities, and you have this idea that the private sector can solve problems that have only been intractable because the regulatory state is getting in the way. And so the first makes, well, maybe opioids would be safe for these safe people, these, white people with health insurance going to doctors. And the second says, we don't, pain advocacy reformers, you've been wanting all these social investments to help deal with people in pain. Let the magic of the market solve it for us. We've got these companies chomping at the bit, get the government out of their way. And so that's when millions of dollars flows into these pain advocacy groups. And, with the best of intentions, none of us can swear that we would not be affected by that kind of money. So, and it changes from being this multifaceted, multi-directional kind of effort to address pain to being a call for more opioids for more people.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, David, for this discussion. More importantly, thank you for the book. And thank you to all of you who have been able to join us on this afternoon. And thank you, Carrie, for organizing this for us as well. It's been a real pleasure.
This has been a fantastic discussion. Thank you, Drs. Campbell and Greene and Roberts, for being our panelists and helping to celebrate the launch of David's book. We're really glad you could all be here. This has been a great discussion. And for those of you who haven't checked out the book, please go ahead and get yourself a copy. It is now in stores.
All right. Take care, everybody, and be safe.
Thanks again. Congrats and thanks, David.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you all.
Congratulations.